All right, I think that's given us enough time for everyone to join. So I'd just like to hand over to the head of the ESCAP Pacific Office, Iosefa, to welcome everybody. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Pacific Breakout session. My name is Iosefa Maiava and I'm the head of the ESCAP Pacific Office. This session will run for about 20 minutes and it consists of a short presentation followed by Q&A. For the Q&A session, we have already received some questions, but if time allows, we will entertain other questions which can be submitted through the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box, so submit your questions through there. Given the report is about tracking progress against the SDG via the data, we request you keep your questions data focused as much as possible. I'd like to hand over now to my colleague Chris Ryan to present some of the initial findings from the 2021 Asia Pacific Progress Report for the Pacific sub-region. Chris?
Okay, thanks very much, Iosefa. So our brief presentation to kick things off, it's going to be two-part. I'm going to do the first part of the presentation, and that will be very much focused on the data and statistics side of things that came out of the progress report for the Pacific, and then I'll just hand over back to Iosefa to wrap things up a little bit. To start things off, I mean, my presentation is going to be looking a little bit repetitive of what you saw earlier from Gemma. That's not because I want to show the same sort of results that she has. I mean, what I'm doing is I'm presenting the same sort of things, but for the Pacific region. So one of the initial graphical analysis she showed for Asia Pacific, was showing at the goal level how the Asia Pacific region was tracking in reaching the targets for the 2030 agenda. As you can see, I mean, for the Pacific, for each of the 17 goals here, for any of the goals to be on target, those bars on the left-hand side need to be reaching the 2020 line. And as you can see, none of them have reached that line yet, which means we need to accelerate or turn things around across all the goals in the Pacific. There's also, we've got the situation with 3 goals heading backwards: reduced inequalities, responsible consumption and production, and also peace, justice, and strong institutions. Just quickly, one thing where this graph's a little bit different from the Asia Pacific graph is the sort of diagonal bars across some of these bars. They indicate that there's weak strength in data, and we have a lot more of those in the Pacific than what you saw earlier for the Asia Pacific analysis. So that's sending a signal that we need to try and get a lot more data for the Pacific region. This is another chart that Gemma showed earlier. So once again, I'll be showing something similar, but for the Pacific region. Just to kick things off, I mean, the first few targets that have just appeared on the screen in green, these are the targets where for the Pacific region as a whole are currently on track. And as you can see, there's only about, I think it's 8 of those across the 169 targets. Yellow is indicating, as Gemma said earlier, I mean, that we need to accelerate things, but they're not going backwards, but they're also not on track, and that's situation for 45 of the targets in the Pacific. Red are the ones we probably need to be most concerned about. That's indicating that things are regressing, and there's 15 targets regressing for the Pacific. And once again, this is a big difference for our analysis as opposed to Asia Pacific. We have a lot more grey, and for the similar reasons I mentioned on the last chart. That is, there is just a lot less data in the Pacific region to be able to tell a full story. Moving along, this is a little bit of a different chart to what you saw at the plenary. I mean, this has given you a bit of an indication about data availability at the indicator level, at the country level. So although things look okay for some countries in the Pacific. I mean, countries like Fiji and Samoa, they're producing nearly similar amounts of data as Australia and New Zealand. I mean, even there, it's still less than 50% of the indicators those countries have sufficient data for. So it's still a strong indication that there's a lot of work needs to be done to fill the data gaps in the Pacific. All that sort of analysis you can actually see in the SDG progress report, which we're releasing today. The next couple of slides, it's just 4 little bits of analysis where I just want to try and whet your appetite a little bit about some of the additional sort of things you can do yourself, not by researching the report, but by accessing the SDG gateway, and which Gemma touched on, and I'll talk about a little bit more. There's an absolute wealth of information up there on this SDG gateway, which you won't see in the report. So these next couple of graphs is just to whet your appetite, as I said. So looking at these first couple, and the 10.C.1, I mean, that's looking at the remittance costs as a proportion of remittances. Although we don't have a huge amount of data, I mean, if you look at this trend, you can see that things are getting better. It's a little bit cheaper to send remittances to these countries. But it's still around the 10% mark, and the target for this, the target for this target's 3%. So we're still a long way short of where we want to be, even though there's improvements being made. In the next one on the renewable energy, you can see quite clearly there not much had really happened up until 2011, but we're seeing a lot more progress in the use of renewable energy in the last few years, especially per capita for some of the smaller countries. And just quickly, I mean, the next graph, I mean, is just looking at its unsentenced detainees. You can see increases in trends for some of the countries here, which is not the way we want to be going, signifying we need a bit of work there. And the fourth graph's looking at internet usage, and although things are looking quite good and improved there, we're still quite a bit behind more developed countries. Okay, so just very quickly, I just want to promote this as well, along with what Gemma did. This is where you go to find out all this information, and there's just a wealth of information up there from a data perspective that's not covered adequately in the report due to the limitations, but there's just so much more there. I really encourage you to have a look at this website and explore your way around it. If you have any issues, get in contact with ESCAP. We can help you. And just finally, before I hand over to Iosefa, I just also want to promote this National SDG Tracker. I see it as a little bit of a saviour to helping countries in the Pacific to fill some of these missing data gaps at the moment. It's a new initiative, hasn't really got off the ground across Asia Pacific in general, but our team here in the Pacific are very keen to push it along, and we've already instigated initial discussions with the Pacific community and PIFs and UDP and so forth on how we can get this initiative up and running. So please keep your ears out for it. You'll be hearing from us soon, and we hope you get behind it, because we see a real future in this tracker. That's all. I'll just hand over to Iosefa. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I will continue the presentation by talking about the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, which will be held 23rd to the 26th of March. As you heard from Gemma, this is main multi-stakeholder platform for the Asia Pacific region. It is a preparatory meeting for the high-level political forum, so it's really an important occasion to try and align the global commitments on SDGs with the Asia Pacific commitments. It is an annual and inclusive intergovernmental and regional platform for supporting countries, in particular those countries in special situations like the Pacific Islands, small island developing states, and LDCs. So it's very important that the Pacific SIDS and LDCs to take advantage of this opportunity. The second point I want to make about the APFSD is that it focuses on regional perspectives on the implementation of, and regional actions, many of which are quite relevant for the Pacific. In particular, for example, climate change, climate action, and oceans. As you know from the overall Asia Pacific SDG report, these are the two areas where the Asia Pacific region as a whole is regressing, and it's really important that the Pacific works through the APFSD and other forum to make sure that they reduce the impact of that regression on the Pacific in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and in decreasing pollution, plastics, oceans. So the final one is on the theme of the. I'll go back to the previous slide. The APFSD also is a good occasion to review the progress of the 2030 agenda through the VNRs, and I note that this year Republic of Marshall Islands is going to be presenting its VNR, and I think the APFSD is a good opportunity to receive support for that. And then the theme, of course, is for this year is sustainable and resilient recovery from COVID-19 pandemic in Asia Pacific. On the next slide, this is the priority areas leading into the Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development. So APFSD is the Asia Pacific Regional Forum for Sustainable Development. For the Pacific, it is the Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development. And it is really important to recognize that this forum is a preparatory meeting for APFSD and therefore serves the purpose of trying to align as much as possible the regional commitments on SDGs with those coming from the Pacific. You see there the priority actions 1 and 2 on persisting inequalities and persisting environmental and resource use challenges. I know the reviews of national of the VNRs, the voluntary national reviews that have been undertaken, as well as the COVID-19 impacts, suggest that there is a trend or there is a move towards greater social and environmental consideration in the development agenda. This, of course, needs to be harnessed and mobilized to make a difference. Otherwise, that shift won't be sustained. And the Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development is a good platform to do that. On the priority action number 2, that is on climate, which includes climate change and oceans, and 3, which includes transport, trade, and investment. These are areas where Asia and the Pacific Rim countries have major influence. And the Pacific, through the Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development, for example, would need to look at better ways of harnessing and mobilizing that kind of influence to contribute to better results in the Pacific. And then the final point here is that the priority area number 4, this is focusing back on the Pacific. The reviews of the national voluntary national reviews undertaken so far indicate that the Pacific governments themselves, they need to assume a greater sense of ownership and political will over the inclusive and sustainable development agenda, the 2030 agenda. And there's also a need for national, regional, and global alignment of commitments, including on data, as we've heard. And there's also a need to improve the multi-stakeholder platform, which means increasing the awareness of and engagement through the multi-stakeholders platform, including support from the countries. These are the same challenges that were identified during the Millennium Development Goals days. So it is concerning that we are still hearing about these challenges. And so I think it calls for a more serious sort of attitude, more serious attempt to try and address what may be the underlying reasons why we still have these challenges around the VNR and the Sustainable Development Agenda. I'll stop there and move on to our next session, or the next segment of our, which is to have an Q&A. we had some questions which were received before the event, and I'd like to start, and this is around the SDG tracker, and we'd like to ask Chris to this question. And it's from Alison SPC. We have talked a lot in the Pacific about the contextualizing the SDG indicators at the national level and using proxy indicators due to the enormous data burdens faced by countries. Do you think the national SDG tracker could help countries decide what related indicators would help them tell their development progress against the 2030 agenda?
Okay, thanks, Iosefa, and thanks for the question, Alison. I think it's a really valid and important question. I think that the second part of your question, you're near when you're saying, do you think the national SDG tracker can achieve this? I mean, this is basically, in my understanding, although it's still in its early days and it's not fully up and running, this is exactly what I see the national SDG tracker is trying to achieve. I mean, when you delve into the data for some of these countries within certain goals, I mean, you'll often come across situations where a country might only have 20 or 30% of the indicators to track progress against a particular goal. And it might be a couple of things where they're going backwards, whereas the complete story for that goal for that country, if they had other bits of data, it might be telling a totally different story. So it sort of gives a false reading. So I think it's just creating this opportunity for countries themselves to review what indicators they have at the national level, tracking this progress, creating that opportunity to add indicators which tell a more complete story, and doing this. I mean, I would break it down goal by goal. So you just, rather than telling 20% of the story, hopefully you can start telling like 60-80% of the story. So when a lot of those charts which we were showing earlier, although it's very useful information and generates a lot of interest, when we look at them at the regional or sub-regional or even at the country level, it will just be a much more complete and better story if with utilising the national tracker and giving countries the opportunity to add additional indicators. So hopefully that answers your question. And hopefully, I mean, you also touched on the question of burden on countries. I mean, there is a lot of emphasis on the moment in filling data gaps in the SDG indicator framework. If some of that emphasis could be more on identifying additional national indicators, which are also equally important, I can see a reduction in burden as well. But yeah, thank you for the question.
I think got some follow-up questions. We've got some follow-up questions in the chat box on the tracker. Is the national SDG tracker an app? And then there is a question about how the ESCAP SDG Gateway and the ESCAP National SDG Tracker complement the SPC SDG dashboard for reviewing and analyzing SDG progress in the Pacific. Are there differences and or similarities, such as in data sources? And I think there was an earlier question on chat too about data sources, asking whether, what are the data sources being used for the Asia Pacific SDG progress report.
Okay, so I think you were throwing the two questions at me. I mean, so the first one is the national SDG Tracker an app? And I guess is how we define an app. I'd view it more as a tool, but it is all online. So it's sort of going to be operating in a way that, I mean, it's at the moment, ESCAP, we have our SDG indicator database, which doesn't just cover SDG indicators, but a few proxies as well. And that's what's been telling those progress stories that you've been seeing over the last hour or so. Now, what we envisage to happen with the national SDG tracker is countries will be able to have access to this database to add their own national high priority indicators, which they will be able to upload themselves and monitor. They won't necessarily be able to influence the uploading of the standard indicators that ESCAP Statistics Division are looking after. But I do understand that the countries will have the power it'll be a controlled sort of access, but have the power to upload additional indicators to this national database for them. Whether or not that would then be referred to as an app or a tool, I'm not sure. It's still not up and running, but it's along those lines. And the second question, related to PICS, how does ESCAP Gateway and ESCAP Nationality Tracker complement the SDG dashboard for reviewing? Yeah, this is a good question, and we're not sure at the moment. And the reason being, I mean, we're very much aware of what SPC are doing with their SDG dashboard, and this is a new tool from ESCAP. So we're only just starting to reach out to some countries now who might be interested. But before we do that in any sort of proper way, we've been in contact with not just SPC, with the Statistics for Development Division, with Apelli and his team, but also with Pacific Island Forum Secretariat and also UNDP. And we want to partner up with anyone who's working in this space. And SPC will be one of the key partners there to see, if we do enter this area of promoting the national SDG tracker, we have to do it in a way in which it's going to complement activities which are already up and running in SPC, such as the SPC SDG dashboard. So we haven't even we've just exchanged a few emails at this stage, and we're showing a lot of interest to work together, but we haven't had that first sit down meeting as yet. And we want to do that before we start reaching out to the countries.
There is that question from Lupe about the official reports or official data being used to extract the data used in the 2021 SDG progress report.
Okay, so the question, what official reports or official data we use to extract data towards the report? This question was answered sort of by Gemma in the plenary. So the way it works, all the data up on the ESCAP SDG database, it comes from development partners or the custodian agencies of those indicators. So the countries produce information, it's passed on to the custodian agencies, and then it gets up onto, not just the ESCAP database, but as Gemma mentioned, it's the United Nations Statistics Division database. So they're not tapping into country reports at any sort of sector or ministry level. It's sort of more, it goes through the custodian agencies overlooking the data. I hope that was clear. But it's a very similar question to what Gemma answered a bit earlier.
Thank you, Chris. I think there are some follow-up questions on data that's come through the chat box, and then I think maybe we start with the overall sort of question about your diagnosis of this issue of persisting problems with data. The question is, statistics seem to be a persisting issue since 20 years ago when you were at SPC. And so what is your diagnosis? And perhaps in relation to that, think about the role of the NSOs, the issue of data availability in the territories being very low, and what the role of the NSOs could play to improve coverage.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to make mention of here. I mean, one is, yeah, whoever asked the question from PICS is 100% right. I mean, the amount of noise being made about the situation of data and statistics in the region now is as loud, maybe even louder than what it was 20 years ago. And part of that is possibly, well, not part of it's possibly, I mean, some of it is definitely due to the fact that data and statistics are just getting so much more attention now than what they were 20 years ago. The SDGs alone have nearly doubled the attention on data and statistics. So there is a tendency to talk about a little bit more and complain about us not getting what we want and what we need. The other point I'd like to make is, whilst there is still a lot of complaints or discussions about the quality of the statistical products being generated around the region, if you were to take any NSO within the Pacific and look at what they were producing 20 years ago and compare it to what they're producing today, you would see massive improvements. Meaning what they're producing, how they're producing it, the skill sets within their national statistics offices. So I think, the fact that there is this continued attention on data and statistics, which hasn't changed much in 20 years, it's not due to the fact that there aren't great improvements being made. It's just the expectations and the demands have increased quite considerably. And I'm not saying we can't make a lot more improvement though.
Yeah, I think just one more lot of information before we move back to because this is the last, I think, of so there is an interest that is relating to the sheet slides on priorities, which you presented in your presentation.
Yeah, so there's a question there. There's a sheet side on priorities. Who developed them? Government. So I just need to clarify which slide that question's referring to. Oh,
okay, I think that's the last slide. Those priorities are taken from the combination of the review of the voluntary national review undertaken so far, the impact assessment on COVID-19, as well as the discussions that we had at the Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development in December last year. And it reflects to a large extent the findings of the Asia Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development. So the suggestion there is for these priority action areas to be taken further, to be discussed more thoroughly, and start looking at what options or action areas that the Pacific region will take, including in relation to the Asia Pacific region as a whole. So yeah, that the proposal is for those priorities to be taken into the Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development meeting in October this year. But in terms of whether or not they were endorsed, developed by governments, no, this was developed by us based on various processes and platforms that we've been engaged with. Yes, go ahead. And Chris, there is that unanswered question on the. Is there a way to link the national tracker to existing similar portals to alleviate possible redundant reporting?
Okay, so I see that question's come through for FSM. I think it's a very good and very important question for FSM, because you guys in recent times have done a fantastic job in setting up your own SDG data portal website. So the last thing we want is to see is the SDG national tracker come along and try to replace something like that. So as I said earlier on, communications with other partners and how we can combine efforts, in particular talking about SPC. When we reach out to the countries and countries show an interest in adopting an approach like this, the first thing we will want to be doing is, how can we promote this in a way in which it's not going to be stepping on the toes of the work that the countries are already doing. In fact, I mean, how can it better develop or expand on the work that's already been done? So, I mean, 100% yes. I mean, we will want to link it together with what you're doing. It's not going to be a one or the other or a replacement. So, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's a relevant question for other countries as well. Thank you.
Yeah, there's one last follow-up question on data. This is from Looping Tong again. Follow-up question: given that the data are extracted from development partners or custodians, how does it complement the country's VNR and statistics SDG progress reports?
Okay, so the question is from Tonga, given the data extracted from development partners or custodians, how does it complement the country? So the VNR and the SDG progress report, I mean, I mean, what we're doing is we're starting with the indicators which are currently in the ESCAP SDG database. And that's going to be probably a little bit different to what's in your statistic SDG progress report or potentially your country VNR. And all we're doing is then using the indicators in the ESCAP SDG database, look at what's in your national indicator framework and see if any of those indicators are useful or worth adding to what's within any of the goals within what's in the ESCAP database. So they are quite similar, but I mean, if you took any one of those three different indicator frameworks, they'd have a few little differences. But at the end of the day, I think we want to work towards one ultimate national sort of indicator framework, which helps you report against the SDGs, your VNR, as well in all your national priorities. So, I mean, the more we work together, with countries and partners, the more similar these different sort of national indicator frameworks should start to look. So, yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, there's some sort of, it looks a little bit sort of messy at the moment, how they align and what similarities and differences they add, but we're trying to work towards one common sort of indicator framework product, which keeps countries and partners happy. I hope that addressed your question.
Okay, really the very last question on this, and that's on proxies. The use of proxies to report on SDG Tracker.
Well, I mean, that's a very easy and short answer. I mean, yes, that's exactly what the SDG or National SDG Tracker is all about. Countries identifying important proxies for them, which are highly relevant to their national circumstances, which they can then include as part of their indicator framework when tracking progress against the SDGs. So it's not just a yes, it's very much encouraged.
Okay. Thank you. And there is a follow-up question from the CEO of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Samoa. That is, and perhaps Jan may want to jump in here as well, if you can. Is ESCAP looking at some states recognizing data from national level to update the ESCAP SDG gateway, especially for countries that have their own SDG indicator matrix?
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure if there's a strong need for that. I mean, because with the national SDG tracker, I mean, you're sort of getting the best of both worlds. I mean, you'll have all your own, all the indicators that ESCAP monitoring, whether it be SDGs or the proxies they have in their database, and then you don't have to address all of them when you're telling your national story, but you can add whatever you want from your own national indicator matrix to that. Now, if the question is more about influencing what goes up on the the ESCAP SDG indicator database from a country like Samoa, I mean, if it's a good indicator which a custodian agency picks up and it supplies it to the the global stage, with ESCAP and Stats Division, sure, but there's probably a process that needs to go through first. I don't think it's not going to be a process where Samoa think that indicator's important, therefore it needs to be added to the ESCAP SDG database. So, but I don't, as I said, I don't see a strong need for having that as part of the process at the moment, because you can already add as many of your own nationally important indicators to your monitoring progress. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. There's no more question from the chat box. So, but we do have about 5 minutes left, and yeah. Just wondering if there's enough time to get into. There's just one question that came before the session that was from Howard Politini, the director of PIPSO, on the what the strategic framework for advancing is about, and I just wanted to say that for the Pacific, it's the Pacific Roadmap for Sustainable Development, which integrates the SDGs with the Samoa pathway and the framework for Pacific regionalism. So I think that is the one that needs to be recognized as far as the Pacific is concerned. The issue there is the going back to data is the indicator framework, which has 132 indicators that really do need to be reviewed for their relevance and for their applicability to the Samoa pathway, for example, or to the framework for Pacific regionalism priorities. If that indicator framework as part of the Pacific Roadmap for Sustainable Development is going to be recognized as a common indicator framework, I think that's the main point I want to make there in response to that question from Howard Politini. Is there any? Okay, so we've got 2 more minutes, but there is a quick question follow-up from Pista from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Doesn't that then have an implication from country to region in terms of progress reports based on the answers?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Seth. I mean, there will be a different sort of progress report, because I mean the reports that ESCAP might be focusing on for the region, they will be based on a different set of indicators from what the national SDG tracker might be using for a particular country. But we're happy to live with that. I think it's more important. I mean, it's that the countries have more control over the final set of indicators that are going to be monitoring progress for them. And if they see a lot of good value in adopting a large number or even a small number of additional national indicators, which are important to them under various range of goals, then we're looking to encourage that. So, yeah, I mean, you might end up telling a different story than what, because you're using different indicators at the regional level, but I think it's still a stronger story. So it's just you can't please everyone. So I'm hoping that sort of answers the question, Paseta. So we're aware it's going to be different indicator frameworks, but I think it's from a national perspective, there's plenty of gains to be made out of that.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I think that brings us to the end of this breakout session. We've had no more questions from the chat box. So it remains for me to say thank you so much for attending the launch of the SDG Progress Report. and attending this breakout session. This launch was just a very brief introduction to the full report, which we encourage you all to review more thoroughly. A link to the report has been circulated in the flyer that was sent to the Pacific participants and will be accessible immediately after this launch. As discussed during the presentation, we also encourage you to visit the ESCAP SDG Gateway, where the full array of ESCAP data products monitoring SDG progress can be reviewed. So on that note, I want to thank you once again for joining us today and wish you a very good afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the Pacific at this point in time. Thank you.